I want to frame our consideration of war with a study of blood. Blood that is shed by human and superhuman violence. The cost of war in our kind of common discourse today is often described in terms of blood and treasure. And in Weird John Brown, Smith, the author, records John Brown's final words, which are these: I, John Brown, am now certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think vainly, flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done. So Brown understands bloodshed to be possibly at least purgative. It can purge land of guilt, guilt that has accumulated from the wicked deeds done on that land. And he does not seem to mean that the war he anticipates, what turned out to be the U.S. Civil War over the enslavement of Black Africans in the U.S. South, will purge the land of the U.S. of guilt by the justice of that war. That's not what he means. He seems to mean that bloodshed, whether by good people or bad people, whether in a supposedly just cause or an unjust one, does something to the balance of power. Apparently, the bloodshed reaches a certain extreme, at which point people lose the will to shed blood in war anymore for the time being. And so the open violence of war ends, the guilt of the land in that way purged, at least for a time. This seems to resonate with the biblical witness with respect to wrath. Governments and their peoples store up wrath with their protracted injustice until the dam breaks. And it does not make the violence of wrath just. It's often wielded by corrupt political regimes against other corrupt political regimes. But as the wrath tears through a generation, a new balance of power emerges through the horror, and so the wrath is consumed. At the heart of the New Testament is the bloodshed of Jesus, which was the culmination of the sort of life that he lived. We need to recognize that we would not be particularly concerned with the bloodshed of Jesus if it hadn't been for his resurrection, which revealed the power of his bloodshed and set off a movement that has continued since then and claimed us. His bloodshed was part of a struggle unfolding in his generation, one that finally encompassed the bloody destruction of so many in his generation in war decades after Jesus' death on a cross. We would apparently not be concerned with Jesus' bloodshed if it had not been for the bloodshed of his generation, which so determined the trajectory of the people of God in the world. In the New Testament, there is no justification of the causes that led to Jesus' death, as if the outcome of his resurrection cast a cleansing ray of light on the evil that brought it about. The Bible does not traffic in the logic of the ends justifying the means. Whatever good it attributes to Jesus' death, this does not make the way that he died good or justified. The means whereby he came to shed his blood are horrible. If the New Testament did traffic in the logic of the ends justifying the means, we might expect it to celebrate Judas, or at least saying that what Judas meant for evil turned out for good. But instead, Jesus says this about Judas: the Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born. And yet the blood that Jesus sheds by such horrible betrayal, corruption, and violence is nevertheless presented to us as the blood of the covenant, which Jesus gave to his disciples to drink and told them it is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. Jesus said this to his disciples in the midst of telling them that one of them would betray him. And afterward, he told them they would all desert him that same night. So this blood is not shed by just uh, people. It's not shed for just people. The power of this bloodshed is the forgiveness of sins, which in the Bible means the bodily repair of the debts human beings and communities have inherited because of the wrong that those before them have done and the wrong that they have continued to do in their own generation and bodily lives. Now, this is the same blood that the crowd before Pilate calls down upon them and their future generations in the same gospel when they call for the bloodshed of Jesus. The authorities of Jesus's people in Jerusalem persuade the gathered crowd to demand Jesus Barabbas instead of Jesus, the so-called Messiah. Pilate doesn't want to give in to the authorities, but a riot is about to start. So Pilate claims to be innocent of Jesus's blood, even as he is the one who then orders him to be crucified. Then all the people gathered say, "His blood be upon us and our children." They mean to curse themselves, but of course, Jesus's blood is for forgiveness. We've learned at that Passover meal that he shared with his disciples, his betrayer among them, and all of them eventually proving to be deserters. It's blood for forgiveness for unjust people, and therefore blood of forgiveness for these people that are gathered as a mob calling for the bloodshed of Jesus to the extreme of cursing themselves to emphasize how committed to that bloodshed they are. They find themselves calling down upon themselves and future generations the blood of the covenant, which will bring the forgiveness of their sins. In this testimony of Matthew's, it's clear that Jesus' blood is not shed as a transactional necessity to achieve peace as its calculated outcome. It's not that kind of sacrifice, despite the fact that this logic lies at the heart of most popular Christian understanding of atonement and salvation. It's not, in fact, a sacrifice to necessity, as the logic of violent sacrifice operates in our discourse and imagination today, even beyond Christian doctrine and talk. It is the eventuality, this bloodshed, of Jesus's stubborn persistence down the way of resistance to the corruption of his people and the world, the lengths to which his love of the Father and his love of neighbor have taken him, plunging him to the depths of solidarity with his diseased and demonized community, finally triggering and exposing the violence of his closest friends. Jesus' blood is shed as a consequence of betrayal by his own disciple, as we've said, but Judas is not a lone wolf. He is a member of the church that Jesus is building according to Matthew, the church whose other disciple members desert Jesus, whose foundational rock has played the Satan against Jesus. Peter tempted Jesus to refuse the costs of living by the word of the Father. And this is the same blood that all the people now here at the end of Matthew gathered before Pilate called down upon themselves and their children as a curse. It's the blood of the covenant, which all the people call down upon themselves and their future. Because God the Father then raises Jesus from among the dead, Jesus, the dead, we should probably remember that Jesus has liberated while dead, according to 1 Peter. That's the passage we read for last week. Because God the Father then raises Jesus from among the dead, the power of this blood that he has shed transforms the people who have spilt it. In the wake of the horror of Jesus' death, when he has been raised, they can be horrified at themselves, their eyes open to the illusions of violence that had seduced them. illusions of avoiding shame, illusions of gaining control, illusions of a reliable safety. And so Jesus' blood of the covenant produces a changed way of relating to one another and of knowing each other, a forgiven way that is itself a forgiving way, not a cheap forgiveness, but a bloody forgiveness, one that requires facing the horror of what has been done. It's crucial to see that Jesus' blood is not shed for the innocent, but for the guilty, not for people who are faithful to Jesus to the end, but especially for those who betray him and clamor for his torture to the point of cursing themselves. It's precisely by the way that people have participated in the shedding of Jesus' blood that its power acts on them and in them to expose the horror of their sin and to move them to ways of repentance that refuse the illusions of their violence and follow the light of the one who is now risen. It's the nature of Jesus' blood to exploit the power of our sin, to feed the power of our transformation. Jesus' blood has this power not as a necessary sacrifice, but as an unnecessary gift. As unnecessary gift, it becomes the curse all the people called down on themselves so that they poison themselves with his remembrance, which is his transforming love. The Gospel of John brings this quality of Jesus's blood into bold relief. After feeding the 5,000 and their families during Passover on the remote side of the Sea of Galilee, and then fleeing the crowd's fervent attempt to crown him king as breadwinner for the people, Jesus teaches in the synagogue that he is the bread of life. He has indeed come to feed his people, but not only their daily bread, more than their daily bread and also their daily bread. He's come to multiply that bread as the bread of life by refusing to conform to hopes that calculate outcomes without trusting him, that rely on some knowledge that is extrinsic to his own mystery. The people imagine that their ancestors trusted Moses after that first Passover because of Moses' power to feed them bread in the wilderness. But Jesus teaches them that manna was a gift from the Father rather than a satisfaction of their demands. And the fullness of that gift, bread from heaven in the flesh, now speaks to them, saying that he refuses to be our king on our terms. Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me, whoever trusts me, will never be thirsty. Much like we continue to do ourselves, the people of Jesus' generation that are pictured here in John complain that they know Jesus too well to trust him this way, to entrust their lives to him. Jesus is too mundane, they imply, to be bread of heaven, when all they think they need from him is daily bread. But Jesus tells them that he is the way to resurrection through death, himself the work of the Father, and that walking that way together is a matter not of accommodating Jesus to what we think we need, to our terms of necessity, but believing that he is what we need. The bread of life is the flesh of Jesus. So Jesus said to them, very truly, I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man, the future of the human, the heir of humanity, and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood have life eternal, and I will raise them up on the last day. For my flesh is true food and my blood true drink. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so whoever eats me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven, not like that which your ancestors ate and then died, but the one who eats this bread will live forever. Jesus said these things while he was teaching in the synagogue at Capernaum. So the way to the fullness of life on the earth is not to use Jesus for something we think we already understand, but instead to consume Jesus himself, and so to be transformed by him as bread of life, to eat the body we have broken, to drink the blood we've spilt, and so to be forgiven, to have our eyes that have been blinded by the sinful illusions of our violence, opened by the violence done to Jesus, to see that even when we have been driven to curse him and to live the consequences of that cursing, it has been a curse that poisoned us with his love and opened ways of living we can now see only by the light of his resurrection. Turning now to Colossians, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things in heaven and on earth were created, things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers, all things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from among the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him God was pleased to reconcile to God's self all things, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through the blood of his cross. And you who were once estranged and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he has now reconciled in his fleshly body through death, so as to present you holy and blameless and irreproachable before him, inasmuch as you continue grounded and steadfast in the faith, without shifting from the hope promised by the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven. I, Paul, became a servant of this gospel. I am now rejoicing in my sufferings for your sake, and in my flesh I am completing what is lacking in Messiah's afflictions for the sake of his body, that is, the church. I became its servant according to God's commission that was given to me for you, to make the word of God fully known, the mystery that has been hidden throughout the ages and generations, but has now been revealed to his saints. To them God chose to make known how great among the Gentiles are the riches of the glory of this mystery, which is Messiah in you, the hope of glory. It is he whom we proclaim, warning everyone and teaching everyone in all wisdom, so that we may present everyone mature in Messiah. And for this I toil and struggle with all the energy that he powerfully inspires within me. So according to this teaching of the Apostle Paul's, Jesus himself is the heart of God and creation. Jesus isn't someone or something that can be subordinated to some logic that would seek to do without Jesus or turn Jesus into its instrument, its mere illustration. Jesus is not an instrument or illustration of something else, but the fullness of God itself, the judge who enacts justice himself, and in this way, the maker of peace himself. As we consume his self-giving for us, then, we're empowered not to reiterate sacrifice as calculated necessity, but to live our lives together as unnecessary gifts that can fill up in the embodied life of humanity what has yet to be fulfilled of Messiah's own afflictions. We're empowered to resist as Jesus did, to love as Jesus did, so as to become the fullness that he is. We're not adding to Messiah's afflictions of our own. We're becoming Messiah's own afflictions as his body, exposing injustice for what it is and the corresponding illusions of its violence by laying bare its horrors and refusing to let them control us. We obviously cannot do that by telling stories of war as stories of necessary sacrifice, and so as stories of triumph. While we must resist the temptation of telling or enacting stories of violence that justify it as triumph, as necessary sacrifice, we cannot deny that if we are being saved from our corruption, we must face the disease of humanity squarely and truthfully. The revelation of peace must expose the damage that has been done, and that must be addressed if it is to be healed, if it is to grow into peace. As I understand biblical testimony, this is why Hebrews tells us that under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. Forgiveness, reparation, healing. This requires that the wounds of injustice and death not be swept under the rug, but faced for the horror that they are, that they be treated. So the law of the covenant brought out into the open the blood spilt over so many human generations past and made animal blood an integral part of covenant life. It made the costs that blood expressed an integral part of covenant life. God's covenant would not allow that blood to be shed without remembrance, to be embodied without end as human sacrifice through killing. Instead, it exposed that human sacrifice as corrupt by God's wrath, so that the life of the covenant channeled the shedding of animal blood instead of human blood to serve a life of transformative witness and hope. And yet, this shedding of animal blood to process grievances without recourse to sacrificing human beings gave way finally to Jesus's blood of the covenant as that witness and hope fulfilled. So we'll see here in Hebrews how the power of blood is gathered by God's covenant, by God's law, by being integrated into the economy of the people's life through the tabernacle and then through the temple, and as a witness to the coming end of that power of blood and bloodshed in the body of Jesus, from where it grows to make peace. Hebrews 9, starting in verse 8. By this, the Holy Spirit indicates, actually, let's see, I think there's, let's start here. By this, the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the sanctuary has not yet been disclosed as long as the first tent is still standing. This is a symbol of the present time during which gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper, but deal only with food and drink and various baptisms, regulations for the body imposed until the time comes to set things right. But when Messiah came as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy place, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood, thus obtaining redemption eternal. For if the blood of goats and bulls, with the sprinkling of the ashes of a heifer, sanctifies those who have been defiled, so that their flesh is purified, how much more will the blood of Messiah, who through the Spirit eternal offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to worship the living God? For this reason, he, the Messiah, is the mediator of a new priestly covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance. Because a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions under the first Levitical covenant, that first priesthood. Where a will is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established, for a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. Hence, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment had been told to all the people by Moses in accordance with the law, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and sprinkled both the scroll itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant that God has ordained for you." And in the same way, he sprinkled with the blood both the tent and all the vessels used in worship. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. So that's what's on this screen here, that passage I just read, the second part of Hebrews. We're here in chapter 9. And so it's key just to note here that the Levitical priestly covenant, this way of dealing with the disease of the human and the rest of creation, and promoting the possibility of memory and life and blessing over generations, it was inaugurated with blood because that covenant itself was the consequence of death, uh, particularly encapsulated in the angel of death and the blood that is involved in the liberation of the people of God from Egypt, and the blood of lambs that they smear over their doorposts to signal the cost that their liberation um, is sort of producing. Thus, it was necessary, just to continue with this passage here, for the sketches of the heavenly things, the tabernacle here, to be purified with these rituals. But the heavenly things themselves need better sacrifices than these. For Messiah did not enter a sanctuary made by human hands, a mere copy of the true one, but he entered into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself again and again and again, as the high priest enters the holy place year after year after year with blood that is not his own. For then he would have had to suffer again and again since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the age to remove sin by the sacrifice of himself. And just as it is appointed for human beings to die once and after that the judgment, so Messiah, after being offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. Okay, so I hope that you've noted here in this passage how the power of this new priestly covenant that is enacted by Jesus in fulfillment of the Levitical covenant is about the transformation of the conscience, especially the liberation of people from a power that has corrupted them, and therefore a liberation of people to love God and to love their neighbor in the manifold ways that the law of Moses commands. I'm not going to take time to look at the other passage that is part of this session on war out of Revelation. I just want to note there in Revelation 15 and 16 that the last seven plagues are presented as the ending of the wrath of God, and they are directed against Jerusalem as a sort of echo of what has taken place against Jesus's own body. And the plagues are directed against Jerusalem and the beast of Rome that the destruction of Jerusalem reveals, exposes. So as we now turn explicitly to the bloodshed of war with this kind of biblical teaching on blood that I've been reviewing in our minds, I think what we'll do is consider World War II as perhaps the war that has most shaped our inherited imaginary of war in the Western world and perhaps beyond, certainly in the United States. Others of you from other parts of the world might comment on this, on what sort of influence this war has had on the imaginary of war where you're from. But what that imaginary has left us with in the United States is this kind of resounding rhetorical question. Are we to be so naive as to think that Hitler could have been stopped non-violently? Are we to be so fanatical as to continue in the ways of Christian nonviolence following Jesus while millions of Jews and many others are mercilessly destroyed? And this question is complicated for many of us by the participation of our family members and other loved ones in the U.S. military in this conflict, both of my own grandfathers among them. Any question about the justice of the conflict calls into question their lives, especially if they died in the fighting. We're quick to call such dying sacrifice with the currents of our time and place, and sacrifices are sacred. So do we dare question the value of their sacrifice, even sacrifice of our loved ones, when it costs so much and when they were obviously such good and noble people who gave their lives in this war? How can we account for the fact that those on the other side, say in Germany or Japan, are apt to ascribe no less value to the lives of their family members lost in this slaughter. Does God allow for both sides to remember our war dead as justified sacrifices as they slaughtered one another? In his novel Hannah Coulter, Wendell Berry tells how veterans of this conflict, veterans of the U.S. military, came home to the U.S. countryside and said next to nothing about what they had experienced in this war. Even to the most intimate members of their families, it seems that they simply did not have words for what they saw, what was done to them, what they did. They were often good people asked to do unspeakable things in the name of serving their country. And as the war wore on, of stopping a murderous tyrant, they were asked to confront one horror with other horrors, assuming that the horror they confronted was in fact the worst one and could be confronted only by committing horrors themselves. This is indeed enough to silence good people. What is there to say? It's the particular achievement of horror to rob us of words and then to exploit the silence and the inevitable fear that accompanies it. And this silence gets filled in time, as trauma is wont to do, with the appetite to justify what was lost and to use that precedent to fuel how we face threats in the present and the future. In the optional material by Ted Grimsrud, in case you got to that, the author points out the various details that are glossed over by remembering the Allies' role in World War II as the violence necessary, supposedly, to stop Hitler, to stop the Holocaust, or to stop a National Socialist Nazi takeover. This tendency to gloss over the details is most instructive for us as we come to the end of our course, because part of the power of violence is to foist itself upon us by glossing over the details. You'll remember Wendell Berry's concern with this in the poem with which we began the course, Questionnaire. It turns out that the Holocaust of the Jews was not, in fact, the rationale invoked to justify the U.S.'s direct military entrance into the conflict. And it turns out that in the name of saving the innocent, the U.S. and others carpet bombed civilian populated cities in Germany and went on to firebomb Tokyo and to become the first and thus far the only political power to unleash the horrors of nuclear weapons on civilian centers in Japan. Horrors that reached finally to my grandpa's body and left wounds on my dad, wounds which in various ways he passed on to me and the rest of my family. It was my grandpa's death of apparently radiation-induced cancer at the age of 46 that left my dad with a mortal fear of such diseases, which in turn permeated his adult life and the way in which my dad himself died. Grimsrud points to Holocaust historians that credit not Hitler, but the escalation of World War II by the United States and others with the horrors of the Holocaust, particularly with the insistence on unconditional surrender. He points out that the price of stopping Hitler the way the Allied powers did was not only the 70 plus million human lives lost in the violence of the war, or the many more millions affected by wounds and trauma and disease, or the political fallout in Eastern Europe, or the fortification of Stalinism in the USSR, or the way this led to the Cold War and the satellite wars of the last generation between capitalist elites and communist elites, one of which was the Korean War, another of which was Vietnam, whose horrors are themselves unspeakable. He points out that we're still living the costly legacy of World War II. As the quintessentially just war, it has furnished the conditions for demonizing other modern powers, racing for various weapons of mass destruction and justifying U.S. violence against not only foreign governments, but foreign civilian populations in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, a variety of Latin American countries, along with increased policing and repressive security measures on the domestic population of the U.S. All is justified by the threat of foreign war and terror. So the death toll of World War II is still rising, it seems. And there's a great deal at stake in the way that that war is memorialized. How we remember a war of the past affects whether wars will take place today or tomorrow, which wars will take place, who will die in them and how they will die. What we tend to do in remembering wars like World War II is to assume a certain desirable outcome scenario and then assume that all of the horrors of the war were necessary to achieve that outcome. So we assume a necessary rather than a contingent relation between horrific violence and an outcome that favors us, which we are quick to assume is an outcome that favors the world. So with World War II, the outcome scenario was that Hitler was killed and the Holocaust of the Jews ceased and the spread of National Socialism was curbed. The horrors of the war, which we usually simply neglect to describe with any patience, were supposedly necessary to achieve that outcome. If we were more consistent and transparent in following this logic, then we would say that carpet bombing German cities, including the hundreds of thousands of children that inhabited them, was necessary to stop Hitler, the Holocaust, and National Socialism. We would name and detail the slaughter to which the United States resorted. If we were more consistent in following this logic of violence, then we would not stop counting the cost arbitrarily with the last shot fired in that war, but would go on to trace the violence and destruction that have grown from it since its aftermath and the legacy of fear and justification of horror that it has left us with. All of this is pushed from our view by the way that we hallow the war with our particular remembrance of it as necessary sacrifice or as just because it supposedly stopped Hitler. The desirable outcome scenario is finally identified with our current conditions of life, which we're ceaselessly told are under threat. So we supposedly live the good life that we do now because of the service and sacrifice made for us by those whom the Allied forces sent to fight for us then, and that such forces continue to send in like manner today. Children have long been pressed into service to achieve this hallowing of the war with the anticipated outcome. The future of our children was what Churchill invoked to call the U.S. ally of the British to arms during Christmas of 1941. We're often told that the militaries must do their awful killing and destruction for the sake of our children, apparently leaving out that the children that are maimed and killed in the fighting and the children who will grow up in lands and societies destroyed. At the end of the day, if we're going to subscribe to this logic of necessity and doing it for the well-being of our children, then we need to come out and say plainly, we believe that in order to save our children, we have to kill other people's children. Intoxicating us with a truncated story of World War II and other similar wars is, I'm afraid, much of what holidays or holy days for the war dead and war soldiers achieve. Although they achieve other things too, to be sure. We memorialize the sacrifice of soldiers with hardly a word or a thought about what and whom they destroyed or what violence the legacy of those wars continues to work in us and the rest of the world. That would seem to impugn the service of those who risked their lives in the name the country that we share with them. And of course, we know that so many of them were wonderful people who were understandably convinced, whether in World War II or in Vietnam or Korea or Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria or Venezuela, that they were and are fighting for a just cause. What they did, it is assumed, was righteous, necessary, and honorable, no matter what, in fact, they did. But telling a more truthful story about war is not about impugning the motives of the soldiers in it, and such motives were no doubt largely the same, whether you were fighting for the Allied powers or for the Axis powers. You're doing what you've been told, fighting for your family and your country, fighting for your freedom. Rather than impugning the motives of the participants or trying to assign blame, telling a more truthful story about war is about speaking the unspoken and even unspeakable violence of it. Much of this violence was Christians killing one another in defiance of Jesus's command that we love one another, because the world will know that we're his disciples by the way that we love one another. Telling a more truthful story involves exposing the contingency of both the history and the outcome of the war. There's nothing necessary about the way the war went. It did not have to proceed or turn out the way that it did. There is no neat chain of cause and effect to be traced. Millions of people did not have to be killed. So many of them civilians. We did not have to kill anyone. Given the contingency of the way World War II went, we cannot begin with Hitler in power and killing off the Jews by the millions and then ask, what should be done to stop this sort of thing? That's simply to allow the arbitrary terms of violence to dictate the terms of the Christian life. Nor can we simply assume that it is the violence of the Allies that stopped Hitler and the Holocaust so much, or so that such violence is the key to our salvation in the present and the future. Why start with Hitler in power and the Holocaust in progress in the way we remember the war and contemplate what should have been done or how to act in the future? What about the role of the German church in the rise of National Socialism to power before the war? What about the way the church spoke about and treated Jews in Europe before the Holocaust? What about the support that the U.S. lent to German industry and arms before the conflict and during the early years of the war? What about the way that the victors of World War I, the U.S. among them, punished Germany at Versailles and promoted conditions in Germany that made National Socialism so attractive? What about the colonialist scramble that led Germany to be envious of what other white Christian powers were winning by their colonial exploits? There's no end to this list of questions and relevant causes of Hitler's rise to power, and yet we rush over them to the scenario of Hitler's already in power and eradicating the Jews and ask, what is to be done to stop this sort of thing? What's to be done is to live the sort of life that discourages all along the way the development of that sort of monster. I've already mentioned that the U.S. intervention may have worsened the Holocaust, according to some historians. Jewish theologian Michael Visegrad credits not National Socialism, but certain Jewish accommodations in modern European society as the primary instruments in rendering Jews eradicable in Germany and beyond. Visegrad contends not for a Jewish response that can nuke a Hitler if another one arises, but a Jewish response of faithfulness to the law of the covenant, of loving God and neighbor. The point then, in exposing the contingency of the way World War II went, is simply to deny that Hitler was necessary, to deny that he can have been prevented or stopped only by the unprecedented violence that the U.S. unleashed, to deny that the Holocaust was the necessary byproduct of the rise of National Socialism, to deny that National Socialism would necessarily have overtaken the world had the U.S. not intervened in the way that it did. We simply do not know what would have happened, and we do not promote peace by dismissing the horrors of World War II as so much necessary sacrifice to stop those horrors or to gain the good life that we or others now supposedly enjoy. This sort of logic of necessity glosses over the details in order to sacralize and sanitize both the outcome thus far and the horrors committed on the way to it. It refuses to count the cost after unleashing the monster and before unleashing it again. This is not incidental because justifying the war has never been about the actual cost. We fail to name in detail the lives or lands or other goods that we were willing to destroy. Justifying entry into the war has been about pursuing a certain outcome no matter what the cost. And this, rather pathetically, we call justice against the grammar of the Bible. So if we gloss over the details, if we truncate our remembrance of the war by saying that it was so much horror to stop Hitler, the Holocaust, and Nazism, then we're fueling the violence by which we continue to arm ourselves against threats to the life we think we saved. If, on the other hand, we remember the slaughter of World War II with patience, detail, questioning, and repentance, then we're arming ourselves peacefully with a life that refuses to demonize part of the world's population, that takes responsibility for the fact that the Nazi Party was democratically voted into power, that is mindful of the contingency of the war and its outcome, that promotes a Christian life that would not be deceived by the scare tactics and fear-mongering that were the stuff of Nazi propaganda, that promotes a Christian life that refuses to settle into hardened international boundaries, but is constantly laboring against those boundaries as the one body of Messiah. One of the results of this kind of truncated remembrance of the war that I'm trying to discourage is not only that we refuse to count the cost, but that we assume that we must build and ready a monstrous war machine now. We say that that machine is only for a just cause, but we build it and ready it for anything that might arise. It's supposedly last resort, but the hand is already on the trigger when conflict arises, aching for details to justify pulling it. On top of this, we become addicted to the market it provides. And so it's not surprising that so many just causes for killing seem to arise. When politicians start out by saying that we will destroy Iraqi civilians and cities and lands to eliminate weapons of mass destruction, and then they switch to eliminating a tyrant, and then they switch to establishing Iraqi democracy in a dizzying array of justifications that somehow supposedly add up to justice, even then, one might be inclined to believe them if the US refused to make a dime off of Iraqi suffering. But in fact, US based or supported corporations and the geopolitical position of the US federal government have been making a killing off of Iraqi suffering ever since that invasion decades ago. And so we need to name that dizzying array of justifications for what it is, a smokescreen for what has characteristically driven wars in resource-rich, geopolitically strategic places of the world according to the Bible, whether the ancient breadbasket of Egypt, the medieval Fertile Crescent between West and East, or the modern energy-rich Persian Gulf. The US is conspicuously unworried about weapons of mass destruction or tyrants or democracy in places where regimes are cooperating with our economic interests, or in places like Africa where they are all but geopolitically irrelevant. We're apparently not concerned about those Hitlers. We're fed a string of supposedly necessary cause-effect relations between the cause of violence and the effect of desirable resulting conditions that are simply false. They're false because the resulting conditions are desirable for only a few and not even for the whole of US society or the places that were the theaters of war. And they're false because the relations between violence and the outcomes are, in fact, not necessary, but contingent, subject to variables that we can hardly pretend to calculate or control. And yet that is what violence claims for itself: calculated ends and unequivocal control. When we start calculating this way, we simply refuse the law of the covenant and the wisdom of Jesus. We refuse the powerful creativity that emerges from spurning violence and the insistence on Christian faithfulness, discipleship. We refuse the cross. We're similarly uncreative when we resort to imposing the death penalty on accused criminals as a supposed deterrent to others instead of creatively laboring against the conditions that have fostered such crimes, the complex multi-generational factors at work in such crimes, and the reform of persons who commit them and their communities. And that reform must include us. We think we're dealing with something by killing people. Likewise, we think we can call those who die for our side in war sacrifice that achieves something for us, when we've been taught by the New Testament that God has provided the final sacrifice in Jesus Christ. So here you see that the violence of World War II, as much other violence, induces a sort of false, idolatrous, messianic complex in us. We surmise at some point that it is our task to stop evil and that we are empowered to do it. But it was Jesus' task to overcome sin, tyranny, and injustice, and it is our task as disciples to live by the power of his victory and to follow in his way of cross-shaped love rather than the way of the passing present age. The logic of history we learn from the New Testament, and this is commentary on the Old Testament, is not cause and effect. It is not that we violently destroy the enemy as the cause and so win peace for us as effect. The logic of history is not cause and effect, but cross and resurrection. And the resurrection is not the calculated outcome of the cross. The New Testament tells us that the cross and resurrection do not conform to any law of cause and effect because they are themselves the law of all God's law, the apocalypse of the God of Israel, who is the God of all creation. So our task is not to calculate neat outcomes, especially of our violence, but to be shaped by the death of Messiah in the way we live and in the way we imagine how we might live. Our task is to pray and to live prayerfully so that the only way things are going to work out is for God to act. As a community, we're not to live according to the pattern of this passing age, which assumes that the history of the world is a history of war, that good things are the way they are because of the wars that have been fought. That's what history class tends to teach in school these days. But as a Christian community, we're not to live in remembrance of war, particularly of our side against that of others. We are to live in remembrance of Jesus, eating his body and drinking his blood, participating not in continued cycles of violence, but of God subjecting God's self in Jesus to the sea of the world's violence and swallowing it up in his body and with his blood.